What if the boy who was beaten so badly at school that he woke up in a hospital bed, unable to recognize his own reflection, would one day build rockets that return from space and land themselves upright on a floating platform in the ocean? What if the man mocked by billionaires, laughed out of boardrooms, and, predicted to go bankrupt within months, would one day become the richest person on the planet while reshaping how humanity drives, how humanity communicates, and how humanity dreams of reaching other worlds? This is not a fairy tale. This is the real story of Elon Musk, a story that did not begin with luck, privilege, or an easy path, but with pain, isolation, relentless curiosity, and a refusal to ever quit, no matter how many times life tried to break him. Before the world knew his name, before Tesla lit up highways with electric cars, before SpaceX turned science fiction into daily headlines, there was simply a quiet, awkward child in South Africa who read books for 10 hours a day because the real world felt too harsh, too lonely, and too cruel to face. He was born in Pretoria in 1971, in a household that looked stable from the outside but was filled with tension. His parents divorced when he was young, and by his own account, home life was difficult and emotionally heavy. He has spoken about a challenging relationship with his father, describing an environment that shaped him in ways that took decades to fully process. School offered no escape either. He was smaller than his classmates, socially awkward, and deeply absorbed in his own thoughts, which made him an easy target. Bullies did not just tease him, they hunted him. One incident left him hospitalized after a group of boys threw him down a flight of concrete stairs and then beat him until he lost consciousness. He needed hospital care and took weeks to recover physically, while the emotional scars lasted far longer. Instead of breaking him into someone bitter, that pain pushed him inward. And inward is where he found his real power. Because inside the pages of science fiction novels and encyclopedias, Elon discovered entire universes he could control, understand, and eventually try to build. By age 10, he had taught himself to code on a Commodore VIC-20 computer. And by 12, he had already written and sold a simple video game called Blaster for around $500. An early signal of a mind that saw computers not as toys, but as tools for creation. Yet none of this made his teenage years easier. He still felt like an outsider, still absorbed constant social pain, and still carried the belief that he did not quite belong anywhere in Pretoria. So he made a decision that many considered reckless for a teenager with no money and no connections. He decided to leave South Africa entirely. At 17, he moved to Canada, largely alone, using his mother's Canadian citizenship as his path out. He arrived with barely any savings, and instead of comfort, what greeted him was a string of exhausting, low-paying jobs. He shoveled grain out of grain elevators in blistering conditions. He cleaned boiler rooms crawling through tight, dirty spaces. He cut wood on a relative's farm for basic room and board, all while chasing an education he believed would eventually open real opportunities. These were not glamorous years. They were survival years, the kind of years where a person learns that comfort is not owed to anyone, and that dignity often comes from doing whatever work is necessary without complaint. Eventually, he enrolled at Queen's University in Canada, before transferring to the University of Pennsylvania in the United States, where he pursued studies in physics and economics, a combination that would later explain his unusual ability to blend deep scientific thinking with business strategy. After Penn, he was accepted into a PhD program in applied physics at Stanford, focused on energy storage, a field directly connected to what would later become Tesla's mission. But this is where his story takes its first major turn, because after only 2 days, he made the decision to leave the program entirely. It was 1995. The internet was just beginning to explode into public consciousness. And Elon believed, with almost reckless certainty, that this was the moment to build something rather than study something. It was a gamble few young people would take, walking away from an elite academic path toward an unproven, chaotic new industry. With his brother Kimball, he started a company called Zip2, essentially an early online city guide and business directory, at a time when most companies did not even have websites. They worked out of a small rented office. They slept there some nights because they could not afford separate housing. And they showered at a nearby YMCA because paying for both an office and an apartment was simply not possible on their limited funds. This was not the image of a young tech founder living comfortably off family wealth. This was two brothers grinding through genuine financial hardship while trying to convince skeptical companies that the internet mattered. After years of relentless work, Zip2 was acquired by Compaq in 1999 for around $300 million, and Elon personally received about $22 million from the sale. It was an incredible win for a first venture, yet instead of retreating into comfort, he did something that revealed his entire philosophy toward risk. He poured almost all of that money into a new venture called X.com, an online banking and payments company. Friends and even close advisors questioned this decision, warning him that he was risking financial security for an idea that could easily collapse. X.com eventually merged with a competitor to form what the world now knows as PayPal. And in 2002, eBay acquired PayPal for $1.5 billion in stock, of which Elon's share was roughly $180 million before taxes. He had, by his early 30s, already built and sold two companies, a level of success that would satisfy most entrepreneurs for a lifetime. But rather than retiring to enjoy that wealth, Elon made a decision that stunned nearly everyone who knew him. He decided to take that fortune and pour it into two of the most difficult, capital-intensive, high-failure rate industries on the planet: rockets and electric cars. In 2002, he founded SpaceX with the almost impossibly ambitious goal of dramatically reducing the cost of space travel and eventually enabling human life on Mars. In 2004, he became an early investor and eventually chairman and product architect at a small electric car startup named Tesla Motors, founded initially by Martin Eberhard and Mark Tarpenning, though it would soon become inseparable from Elon's own identity and vision. Almost immediately, both companies faced enormous skepticism from the outside world. Traditional aerospace experts insisted that a private company had no realistic chance of competing with government-funded space programs. Automotive industry veterans insisted that electric cars were a niche fantasy destined to fail because of poor batteries, limited range, and consumer indifference. Elon ignored the noise and focused entirely on execution. But execution turned out to be brutally, almost unbearably difficult. SpaceX attempted to launch its Falcon 1 rocket 3 separate times between 2006 and 2008, and all 3 attempts ended in failure, sometimes exploding shortly after launch, sometimes failing to reach orbit at all. Each failed launch cost millions of dollars that the company could barely afford to lose. Meanwhile, Tesla was struggling just as severely to manufacture its first vehicle, the Tesla Roadster, facing constant engineering setbacks, production delays, and spiraling costs that pushed the company to the edge of collapse. By 2008, both companies were simultaneously running out of money at the same time, an almost unthinkable crisis for one person to be facing on 2 fronts. This was also the year of the global financial meltdown, meaning credit had frozen worldwide and outside investment was nearly impossible to secure. Elon has openly described this period as the most stressful and painful chapter of his entire life. He was going through a divorce from his first wife, Justine, with whom he had several children, including the tragic loss of their first son to sudden infant death syndrome years earlier, a devastating personal wound that many people did not fully understand he was carrying, while also fighting to keep his companies alive. He was reportedly sleeping on the factory floor at Tesla, working days that stretched past 20 hours, borrowing money from friends just to cover basic personal expenses, because nearly every dollar he had was being funneled into keeping SpaceX and Tesla from going bankrupt. He has said that during this time, he genuinely believed there was a real chance both companies could fail completely within the same year, wiping out everything he had built since Zip2. Then came the moment that would define the rest of his career: the 4th launch attempt of the Falcon 1 rocket in September 2008. If it failed, SpaceX would almost certainly run out of money and be forced to shut down entirely, ending America's most ambitious private space venture before it truly began. There would likely be no 5th attempt, no more funding rounds, no more chances. The launch happened, and against enormous odds, Falcon 1 successfully reached orbit, becoming the first privately funded liquid-fueled rocket in history to do so. It was a razor-thin margin between total collapse and historic breakthrough, and SpaceX had landed on the right side of that line. Barely a few months later, In December 2008, NASA awarded SpaceX a significant contract worth over $1.5 billion to handle cargo resupply missions to the International Space Station, providing the financial lifeline that allowed the company to survive and begin scaling seriously. Around that same period, Tesla managed to close a critical funding round just days before running out of cash entirely. A deal that Elon has described as coming together at literally the last possible moment, with reports suggesting the round closed on Christmas Eve of 2008, narrowly saving the company from bankruptcy. Two companies, on the brink of total failure, survived within weeks of each other, and both survivals depended almost entirely on Elon refusing to give up, even when logic might have suggested walking away. This is one of the most important lessons hidden inside his story. That breakthroughs often arrive disguised as the final moment before collapse. And the difference between failure and legend is often simply whether a person keeps pushing through the darkest, most exhausting stretch right before the turning point. From that fragile foundation, both companies began an extraordinary climb. SpaceX went on to develop the Falcon 9 rocket, and in December 2015, achieved something once considered nearly impossible. Landing an orbital-class rocket booster upright back on solid ground after launching a payload into space, allowing the booster to be reused rather than discarded as waste after a single flight. This reusability breakthrough fundamentally changed the economics of spaceflight, dramatically lowering costs and setting SpaceX apart from every government space agency and competitor on the planet. The company went on to launch astronauts to the International Space Station aboard its Crew Dragon spacecraft starting in 2020, marking the first time a private company had ever sent humans into orbit, restoring America's ability to launch its own astronauts after years of relying on Russian rockets. Meanwhile, Tesla transformed from a company producing a tiny number of expensive roadsters into a global automotive force. The Model S sedan launched in 2012 to widespread acclaim, followed by the Model X, and then the Model 3 in 2017, which was designed specifically to be more affordable and reach a mass market audience rather than only wealthy buyers. Producing the Model 3 at scale nearly broke the company all over again, with Elon later referring to that stretch of relentless manufacturing struggles as production hell, a period where he reportedly slept at the factory for weeks, working alongside line workers to solve bottlenecks personally, rather than simply issuing orders from an office far away. Tesla survived that crisis too, and by the early 2020s, had become the most valuable automaker in the world by market capitalization. Despite producing far fewer vehicles annually than legacy giants like Toyota or Volkswagen, a reflection of investor belief in its long-term vision around energy, software, and autonomous technology. Alongside SpaceX and Tesla, Elon also became involved in several other ventures, including Neuralink, focused on brain-computer interface technology, and The Boring Company, focused on tunnel construction to ease urban traffic, along with later acquiring the social media platform, then known as Twitter in 2022, renaming it X. Each of these ventures carried its own mountain of criticism, technical setbacks, and public scrutiny. Yet each also reflected the same consistent pattern found throughout his entire career, identifying a problem the world had accepted as unsolvable, and refusing to accept that limitation as permanent. What makes this story genuinely useful, beyond simply being impressive, are the deeper lessons hidden inside the struggle. The first lesson is that pain and isolation, when channeled correctly, can become fuel rather than permanent damage. The bullied child who buried himself in books did not escape reality. He was building the mental toolkit that would later let him understand physics, engineering, and business simultaneously. The second lesson is that walking away from a safe, prestigious path, such as leaving a Stanford PhD program, is sometimes necessary when timing and conviction align. But this kind of risk only works when paired with extreme discipline and willingness to do unglamorous labor, like sleeping in an office and showering at a gym just to keep a company alive. The third lesson is that success rarely arrives as a single clean victory. It often arrives as a narrow escape from total failure, which is why persistence during the darkest, most exhausting final stretch matters more than raw talent or initial resources. The fourth lesson is that sacrificing comfort, sleep, relationships, and personal stability for a mission is an incredibly heavy price. One that Elon has openly admitted came with real personal cost, including strain on his family life and his own mental health, reminding us that ambition without any boundaries can create its own kind of damage even amid outward success. The fifth lesson is the power of working directly on the front lines of a problem, rather than only managing from a distance, as seen when he personally worked shifts on the Tesla factory floor during production hell, instead of simply waiting for reports from executives. The sixth lesson is that public failure, whether it was 3 exploded rockets or a nearly bankrupt car company, does not have to be the end of a story. It can simply be the necessary, painful chapter before the breakthrough, provided a person is willing to analyze what went wrong honestly and adjust rather than quit entirely out of embarrassment or fear. Elon Musk's journey is not a comfortable, glamorous tale of an easy rise to power. It is the story of a boy, nearly broken by bullying, who turned inward toward books and computers. A young man who walked away from academic prestige to chase an uncertain vision. An entrepreneur who risked his entire fortune twice on industries considered nearly impossible to succeed in. And a leader who came within weeks of losing everything simultaneously before an almost impossibly narrow rocket launch and a last-minute funding round saved both of his companies from collapse. It is a story built on hospital visits after brutal bullying, on showering at a YMCA because there was no money for anything more, on sleeping on factory floors while carrying quiet personal grief, and on 3 consecutive rocket explosions that could have ended a dream permanently. And yet, from all of that struggle came reusable rockets that landed themselves upright from space, electric cars that reshaped an entire industry, and a level of achievement that reminds us all of a simple, powerful truth, that the depth of someone's success is very often built directly on top of the depth of their earlier struggle, and that the people who change the world are rarely the ones who never fell, but the ones who kept getting up long after everyone else expected them to quietly disappear. If there is one final thought to carry forward from this story, it is this: your current struggle, whatever form it takes, might not be the end of your story. It might simply be the difficult, uncomfortable chapter right before your own breakthrough. And the only way to find out is to keep going. Just a little longer. Just one more attempt. Just like that 4th rocket launch that changed everything.